Today's video, we're going to talk about should I mark macro and micro conversion goals, both primary on my Google Ads account or just only one. So macro conversion goals are going to be like tracking sales. Micro conversion goals are going to be like tracking people adding to something to the cart by itself, or they started filling out a form and then they abandoned the process halfway through. Just so that you know, you should be tracking both or all of those, as much of that as possible, because it's going to help you get your ads going and be more profitable sooner in the process, with the eventual goal to optimize purely for sales, which I'm going to get into. But there's a general misunderstanding that I see guys having in the comments about when should I actually optimize for one versus the other? Should I optimize for both of them at the same time? I'm going to actually clear the air about this on this particular video. Before I get into the content though, if you do not know who I am Corey Zyman, owner of Guaranteed PPC, an online advertising agency that specializes in guaranteeing results for their clients. That is, we do not charge our clients management fees until we can get them a certain minimum lift in the profitability, basically in excess of the management fees that we charge. We're the only agency doing this, but should tell you something about the quality of the information on this video. So with that said, getting into it. So to clear here up about what are these different terms that I'm mentioning here. First of all, you got primary versus secondary goals in Google Ads. Primary goals are used for campaign optimization purposes. If you're using smart bidding, is going to decide how much you're going to bid for an individual person that comes through that matches your targeting settings based upon prior results from people that look like them. So if Google sees that males convert twice as good as females, Google's going to, in the future, use that information to double your bids for males in the future so you can get more conversions at the cost per conversion you want. That's all going on in real time, but they only are going to use the data that you're giving them that's been marked in primary for those decisions that they're doing in real time to decide if your ad should show up for an individual coming through Google search or YouTube or whatever, wherever you're running your ads, or somebody else's ad, or no ads at all, based upon the likelihood of that person wanting an ad, needing an ad, can use that ad. If you're marking a particular conversion goal secondary, it's not used for campaign optimization. It's basically just the opposite of what a primary goal is. But the difference clearly between primary and secondary conversion goals in your ad account, which you can mark any conversion goal either primary or secondary or vice versa at any given time. This isn't set in stone by any means. That's your main difference there. Used for bidding purposes, used for optimization purposes to get you more results, back off of stuff that's not working as well, double down on stuff that is. That's going to happen if a goal is marked in primary in terms of the internal decision making that the algorithm that runs the ads uses, versus secondary, it is not. Now, you may be asking, what's the purpose of Google having a secondary goal if it's not going to utilize the data to make the ads more efficient and scale my ads? And the answer to that is you use secondary goals to build up data sometimes in the background, or to use as backup goals. For instance, I've mentioned it many times on this channel now, if you want to make sure your form tracking goal is working correctly, the only way you could truly do this is by, as far as I still know to this day, and I manage dozens of accounts, is to have a primary and a secondary goal that tracks the same exact thing itself. One that tracks it through Google Ads, one that tracks it through Google Analytics that you then import to Google Ads. And the reason for that is you could run a test conversion through for a form fill or a shopping cart purchase, and that may say that the conversion came through, it works. However, goals can often intermittently only work. So they only work, let's say 50% of the time. Well, you send that test conversion through, you're not going to know your goal's only picking up half the data. The only real way to know that, other than running 100 test conversions, which is, not realistic, you can instead have the backup and the goal marked in primary, a backup goal marked in secondary. You can kind of see what's normal in terms of the ratio of conversions one versus the other, given that Google Analytics sometimes counts a little less conversions than the Google Ads conversion goal you set up strictly through Google Ads. You basically know that ratio pretty much stays the same. So it undercounts at 30%, 20%, whatever it is. And then you can go in there daily, weekly, whatever you want to do, depending on how important your account is to you. You can see if the ratio of conversions tracked for the primary and the backup goal are that similar ratio as it normally should be, to know if your main goal that you've marked in primary that you're supposed to be using for the bidding optimization purposes is actually tracking correctly and normally as it always has itself, okay? Sometimes you will also want to mark a goal secondary because you want to start building up data about people that are coming through and buying. When you start up a campaign like, let's say you're a plumber, ultimately at the beginning, it's advantageous to you you to optimize for phone calls, form fills by itself, not sales. Why? Because it takes a lot more time to gather enough minimum sales data for the ad campaigns to optimize purely on sales data. So you utilize form tracking in and itself to optimize while still trying to build up sales data. So eventually your campaigns are going to use the sales data in terms of which way Google steers your ads, one direction or the other. That's another reason why, or where you would specifically use secondary versus primary goals, okay? Now, the other main definitions to cover here, macro versus micro goals. So a macro goal, this isn't like something I pulled out of a textbook, obviously. This is something that a lot of people will say and I say as well. A macro goal is an action that you're tracking that's closest to profit out of all the goals you could be tracking. An example of this would be a phone call, a lead that you have marked qualified, a sale, that kind of thing. A micro goal, on the other hand, is a goal that you track that's the furthest from the purchase out of all the goals you have. So that would be like somebody starting a form fill but did not finish it, or got to only step 1 or step 2 or whatever, or somebody who added something to the cart but never proceeded to checkout. That would be another example of a micro goal. And going back to what I was mentioning earlier, the reason why you would use both of these, given that you're optimizing for sales, you don't make money off of cart ads or partial form fills at all, right? But you utilize that micro level conversion goals to get your campaigns up and spooled up quicker than what you would if you only had macro goals to optimize from starting day 1 itself, okay? So in other words, from a brand new account standpoint, setting up goals for micro and macro goals is going to get your campaign up to a certain amount of profit sooner than what it would be otherwise if you only were having macro goals in your account. You're definitely always going to want to only optimize strictly for macro goals eventually. The question is, when's the right time to only optimize on macro goals and leave the micro goals to the wayside? And that's going to vary based upon what business you're in. I can't give you a hard, simple answer that'll work for everybody. I could give you some example markets, and then you could kind of understand from those what you should do in your situation. But the main thing that comes up with everything I just described is you track primary and secondary goals in your account together at the beginning, right? The question is, when you track them together, do you mark them both in primary or some in secondary? Well, of course, you track them together and you mark the macro and the micro goals both in primary at the same time. Otherwise, ultimately, Google is not going to be able to truly get the full benefit of the data that you have available. Because you may think, some people might say, well, that's like double counting, right? Like if I'm tracking people who add something to cart and then track somebody who buys something through the cart, isn't that like double counting the same person? It is. However, ultimately, Google is going to see 2 conversions from the same person if they went to buy, which isn't bad because it's going to optimize for a person who does both of the things versus somebody who just did the one thing in and itself. So it's fine if you mark them both in primary itself versus, on the other hand, just having the micro goals in primary and then eventually turning those to secondary and then at the same time switching on the macro level goals to primary from secondary. So our setup will be, at least at the beginning, instead of just micro goals being in primary and the macro goals in secondary, we're just going to run both sets of goals in primary. Then eventually we'll shut off and mark the micro goals in secondary. But at least at the very beginning, the best way to get results the quickest is to mark them both in primary, as per what I found with all the testing at our agency. Okay? Now, at some point, you're going to definitely mark those micro goals in secondary and just tell Google to completely ignore it. Why? Because machine learning systems, including Google's machine learning algorithm that runs the ad system on Google that tries to optimize for the best search results for everybody, including the ads, is only able to do well with a certain minimum amount of data flow coming through. It cannot optimize for sales very well when you give it 5 sales to work off. The more data that it has to look at, the better it will actually do, which is why your results keep getting better for years and years and years in your Google Ads account, even if you were to do nothing other than just maintain the conversion tracking on a sloppy setup, or even on a good setup for that matter. When you are tracking both the micro and macro goals at the same time, both in primary, long term, after you've already collected hundreds, if not thousands of sales, what you're going to simply do is just add noise to the data stream when you have the micro goals set as primary at a certain stage itself, and the algorithm's going to make the most accurate decisions for you and how your ads should be steered when it just has the sales data to look at, which may seem kind of like contradicting what I just said. Isn't Google going to get confused when you're tracking the micro and the macro at the same time at the beginning? No, it will not, because ultimately you're trying to rack up data for the algorithm to look at quicker, which is why you use the macro data at the beginning. And it'll look at both sets of data to identify the most valuable users at the beginning versus the least amount of valuable users, because that's helpful in a situation where you only have, let's say, 10 or 20 conversions. When you get up into hundreds of thousands of conversions, though, the data becomes not optimized for the algorithm when it has overlapping events, if you will. So with that said, I mean, depending on your niche that you're in, you will transition from micro to macro goals in a little different way. And I'm going to give you some example markets where, you would shut off, for instance, tracking, let's say FAQ button clicks and just optimize for phone calls, or shutting off phone call tracking and just optimizing for sales by itself, and how and when you would do it at certain stages, because your ultimate goal, like I said earlier, is to just optimize for sales. But with that said, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, you absolutely should, because the information I'm giving you on this channel is coming from somebody who just doesn't play around with ads for a living. I've ran real businesses. I currently do run real businesses outside of our agency. I have the full perspective knowledge on how to use ads to grow a business specifically, which you're going to get elsewhere. Also, I spend 40 hours a week strictly doing ad strategy at our firm, and then spend my weekends sharing what works. So I literally have to work 70, 80 hours a week to give you the content on this channel that I do. I don't know anybody else on YouTube doing exactly that itself. If there is, let me know, because I want to check out the content myself too. But that information is valuable because of the situation I just described. So if you're serious about making money with ads, subscribe to this channel. It's the best information you're going to find on the topic of how to become a millionaire, multi-millionaire running ads for your business. I promise you that. Furthermore, you should check out my blog on my site. My blog has really good information. In addition, I actually document the strategies we're using to guarantee results for our clients there, with step-by-step instructions, with screenshots. So if you haven't checked that out yet, you absolutely should as well. If you have any questions about anything I'm covering here, you don't think it matches your situation or unsure, leave me a comment below. I get back to every single person that leaves me a question or comment on this channel, usually within 24 hours time. So with that said, everything I just described talked about, basically what you do at the beginning of running your ad account. Should you have macro and micro being primary at the same time? Generally speaking, the answer, at least if you agree with me and you're doing things that the way that I know works the best at our agency after doing this hundreds of times, you're going to mark both of them in primary. The question is, when do you actually make the micro goals secondary, or even the macro goals that are not sales related, which is its own thing to consider and decide upon. There's really never like a precise time where you can say, okay, once you have 100 sales, you're not going to optimize for phone calls and sales anymore, because there's too much variability from niche to niche to have it pinned down to a single number like that. We have general guidelines such as, when you get at least 10 to 30 conversions, you use smart bidding. That in and itself can change. Sometimes we'll do it after 5 or 10 conversions. Sometimes it'll be over 30. Just depends on how things are going. How quickly are we scaling up? How profitable are we already? That kind of thing. If we're profitable already, or maybe we know we're not profitable, we need to get the cost per conversion down 50%. Even though we have 5 conversions already and we only have so much money to get this to work before we run out of money, we're going to switch to smart bidding sooner. It will tamper the campaign sooner, make it not scale as quickly, but at least we're not going to run out of money. So there's a lot of things to consider, a lot of different situations. But when you're trying to decide when to get rid of the micro goals, mark those in secondary, you'll start the process of only using sales to steer your ads. When you get rid of micro goals, your only macro goals is sales, which a lot of times it shouldn't or wouldn't be. You just have to decide what's going to work for you. I call it kind of like a waterfall effect. What you're trying to do is get rid of certain goals for the algorithm that runs the ads at certain stages, knowing that if you remove certain goals too quickly, it's going to hamper your progress scaling. But if you remove them too slowly at the same time, it's going to hamper your results long-term as well, and scaling as well. So it's kind of like you have to do it kind of like on feel, if you will. But the general rule of thumb is, once I've had at least 30 conversions, macro level conversions specifically, tend to mark the micro goals secondary because I don't need them anymore. Okay, sometimes more, sometimes less, but generally that's the case. However, going further here, on the macro level goals, we can often be tracking phone calls, form fills, leads that are marked qualified, and then also sales itself, all of those things. And in that situation, how do we know because your eventual goal, absolutely, if anything's for certain here, be optimizing purely for sales. And if you wanted to go a step further, technically, as I've talked about on other videos, you should be going for for profit margin, because different products and services you have different cost of delivery, and you should be optimizing for different levels of ROAS or ROI that you're generating for different lines of products and services to maximize profit out of Google Ads. But just to keep things simple here, we're talking about maximizing the total possible profit out of Google Ads for our business. We're going to then do that by actually telling the algorithm exactly how much we're making and knowing what we need to generate in terms of a ROAS or return on account spend to be profitable, if you will. We're doing everything we can to raise the sales as much as possible at the target return on investment or ROAS that we know we need to be profitable at. Well, the best way to do that is to actually give it all the revenue data, including it through any offline sales you make through the phone or whatever, and have that be the only thing the algorithm's looking at, because that's the end goal, and that's going to track the closest thing to profit in your business. The more it knows about your actual profit that you're making, the more profit it can make for you. Pretty simple. So at that point in time, generally speaking, if we're talking about an e-commerce business itself, once we get to at least 50 sales, we're going to then start to take that campaign. Instead of optimizing for phone calls, form fills, and sales, we're going to, once we have 50 sales conversions, we're going to turn the goals that track phone calls, form fills, and qualified leads that are marked qualified, if we're doing that, all to secondary, and then we're just going to leave the goals that track sales, both the cart sales and then any goal that tracks offline sales as well that came through the phone, and leave those primary, and then that'll be the final destination, final stop, and how we are tracking conversions and deciding which campaigns or what goals our campaign should use for campaign optimization purposes, if you will. Why 50? Generally speaking, that seems about the kind of general threshold where the algorithm can do pretty well just utilizing the sales data by itself when we're selling product, okay? Now, if we're doing lead generation, okay, now there's an extra layer of complexity involved here. Not only are we tracking partial form fills at the beginning, and then we're going to eventually shut that off after about 30 macro level goals, which are form completions itself, phone calls, qualified lead conversions, and actual sales conversions. At that point in time, once we've gotten to 30 macro level goals, we're going to, once we gotten at least 30 qualified leads, that is leads that we have marked qualified, we're going to consider switching the phone call and the form fill goals as secondary, even though in a lot of cases, we're going to wait until it's 100 qualified leads that were triggered, 100 conversions on our lead that tracks whether a lead was qualified or not, or marked qualified. It depends on the situation. If we're in a high volume business, I'm going to do it after 100 conversions. If I'm in a low volume business, I'm going to do it more so after 30, and I'm also going to be more likely to do it after 30 if the variance in lead quality is high. So there's a big difference in quality of lead between one lead and another. When you're selling to businesses, generally speaking, the leads will be all over the place in terms of quality. So in that situation, I'll wait just for 30 qualified lead conversions before shutting off or marking the phone call and form fill goal secondary, so that I can steer the campaign in the direction of the quality leads that we want sooner, because that's very important to us. If we're like a plumber where every call is pretty much quality, and there's not a big difference between one call and another that we're generating, because that's just how it is in that business, then in that case, I'm going to actually want to optimize for phone calls, form fills, leads that are marked qualified, and sales all together until I've got at least 100, if not 300 to 500 leads that are marked qualified. Why? Because there's not a big difference in lead quality, so the system's actually going to need a lot more data to identify any gaps, what actually makes up a person who buys and then turns into a big job for us, which are like 1 in 5 or 1 in 10. It can't do that very well unless it has more data to look at. So, and optimizing for leads by itself, phone calls, form fills, we could ramp up fairly easy on that. Knowing the lead quality itself is not a huge issue for us, quicker than if we went and switched to optimize for qualified leads sooner in the process. That's just kind of how it is. So if the lead quality you're having is a problem, you're going to switch to optimize for qualified leads and sales alone after 30 conversions. If it's not a big problem, you're going to wait to have 300 to 500 conversions before switching over to just optimizing for qualified leads and sales by itself, to give you the general rule of thumb of where we're at with things. For that matter, in terms of should you just optimize for sales versus qualified leads itself when you're at that final stage, if you will, for the most part, we're going to then optimize for both at the same time by using the same conversion goal anymore. So in other words, our lead that tracks whether a lead's qualified or not, we're going to have the sales revenue that's generated from that lead tied to that lead that is there to track qualified leads. So we'll know from this conversion goal, were they marked qualified? And if a sale occurred, we know a sale occurred just by the value not being zero, if that makes sense. So in that case, there's not really anything to go with, and that's a really good solution to have to go with up front, so you don't ever have to have that final decision of should I optimize for sales or qualified leads or both, if you will. That said, if you are in a situation where very few leads close, you have a low closing percentage, like we're talking 5-10% of the leads close, you should be optimizing for qualified leads separately than the sales, given that ultimately you can switch your campaigns to optimize for qualified leads by itself, and then eventually sales down the line, way later down the line. And you'll typically fare better that way than trying to optimize for both at the same time. Now, as far as macro level goals go, just to clarify this, you're not going to want to have all your macro level goals going at the same time and all in primary. You'll have phone calls, form fills, live chats. Those will be marked primary at first. And then at a certain point, you're going to switch lead goal that tracks leads that are qualified. And then that'll be the only one that's primary. And then eventually you'll switch to having the campaigns of the goal that tracks sales in primary by itself. And then you'll switch off qualified leads. The goal that tracks qualified leads will be marked in secondary as well. So you go from tracking leads to qualified leads, then sales, but you're only going to do one at any given time, if you will. So ultimately, depending on how much issue you're having with lead quality, you're going to go from optimizing for leads to qualified leads maybe after 30 conversions. If not, if lead quality is not a huge issue, you're going to wait till 300 because ultimately the algorithm's going to need a lot more data to identify which leads tend to bring bigger job sizes anyway, if you will. And for that matter, when you switch, assuming that you have a separate goal for qualified leads versus sales, I'm going to switch to optimizing for qualified leads itself after let's say it's the 30 conversion one where you have a big issue with lead quality itself. Then I'm going to wait until I've had at least 100 sales. Why? Because it's going to take a lot of data in terms of, it's the revenue itself for Google to pick up which ones are big, which ones are not. And that's generally the course of action that we're going to go with. So whereas I need less qualified leads to purely start utilizing that as our primary goal source, eventually I'll want to switch over to sales, but I want even more sales than I needed qualified leads in order for things to ramp up most ideally for my campaigns and for my account as possible. Google, the qualified lead data, generally speaking, comes in faster, so I need less of it, being the big thing there. Then with sales, it's all on a delay. So unless I've gotten at least 100 conversions, and because it comes in so slowly and with such a delay, I'm going to want actually more conversion data before I switch over to optimizing purely on sales itself, if you will. When we're talking about e-commerce again, you're going to be optimizing for phone calls, form fills, and sales. And eventually it's just sales itself. Generally speaking, we're not going to ever optimize for qualified leads separately. It's just phone calls, form fills, and actual sales. And after we got at least 50 conversions, we're going to switch over to optimize purely on sales itself, just to rehash what I was saying before. So that's the normal course of action that we have going and starting with the micro conversions, optimizing for those, and the macro conversions. And then from the macro conversion side, how to go from one category of macro to another to get to your end destination of only optimizing for sales, given that if you switch too soon, the algorithm's not going to have enough data to look at and slow you down, or switching to a goal for, rung up on the ladder in terms of closer to being, the sales that you ultimately want. It's also going to hold you back because ultimately anytime you switch from optimizing for one goal to the other, you're going to have a dip in performance while the algorithm adjusts. And if you're, generally speaking, you don't need it because your sales are already increasing strongly or quickly on its own, then you won't want to switch. You want to rack up more conversion goal data on your goal that you eventually want to optimize for, qualified lead sales, first before you make that switch as well. So, and as you make the switch from optimizing for, let's say, leads to qualified leads, you're going to have 30 to 60 days oftentimes where the ad performance you had before is going to dip, anywhere from 10 to 50%. But you need to do it long term, because once you break through that, you'll have a whole nother plateau of results, if you will. I know a lot of this is kind of complicated, what I explained. If you want to know specifically for you in your case, other than leaving a comment, you can reach out to me in my agency. We can have a private conversation where I do a coaching or consulting call with you, and then we can work it out together. I can tell you exactly if that should be what you're doing or something else to unplateau your results in terms of, anything from your ads being an issue to your pricing strategy, to your sales strategy, well-trained in spotting these issues. I also offer, of course, our PPC management services, where we can tell you the 20 different things that you need to make your ads more profitable and do the work for you, and not even take a management fee until we've got the certain minimum lift that we tell you we can get up front. If you are interested in that, reach out to me at guaranteedppc.com. We also sell ad templates. If we've already got the results you're looking for, then we can sell you the winning ads, landing pages, campaign templates that we got results with in a different city or country that you're in, and just use it for yourself. We've worked in hundreds of different niches, so the chances are quite high we've already got the template you're looking for. And for that matter, these templates are so efficient, you could start a whole other business with just by having that template. We've got quite a few businesses now that they heard what they said. They heard that essentially these templates are like a business in a box. They had a business, they took a template, started a side business, outsourced everything to another vendor, and they were able to make that business work, or they sold leads even. So if you're interested in that, let me know. We can tell you what results we got in these different niche markets and what you can get with it. But with that said, ultimately, depending on your niche, it'll vary whether if you want to even do micro goals, which generally speaking you do, that's just assume you basically should, and to what level the macro goal should be set up, given that sometimes the qualified leads, tracking those separately versus rolling that in with the sales tracking and as per one goal, like I was talking about earlier, can be the right way to go about doing things. In other situations, you want to track qualified leads because sales are so delayed, score the leads and use that as your conversion value, and optimize for leads that are high quality and are scored closer to a 10 versus a 1 on a 1 to 10 schedule, which is what we often do at our agency, where sales typically don't happen right away, or we'll track presumed contract value as the conversion value and optimize for the highest presumed contract value if the deal closes. So there's a lot of different variables there. Generally speaking, if you will, the greater the difference in leads that you have from ultimately one customer to another, the more levels of the goals that you want to set up, if you will, because you'll take advantage of another level of performance for each level up that you go. Whereas if pretty much every lead is a grand slam that you get, then you would just simply track sales, because it's not, or should I say even just leads, because you'll have the most volume of data, and ultimately every lead closes at the same rate, so there's no point to optimize for sales data anymore. There's that. Ultimately, I have a fantastic offer for you here. Ultimately, if you just want to be washing your hands of this ad business, it's too complicated, too time consuming, you don't have time to do it, which most of the guys that we work with, they say they don't have time, even though they believe what I'm saying on this channel is correct, which it is, because I'm taking it from personal anecdotes here. With that said, we can actually make an investment in your business. That is, our agency will invest a few tens of thousands of dollars into ad spend in exchange for a cut of your company, and we'll invest all our resources in setting up your ads and managing them, and we'll use that ad money to start a campaign out that will make money, and then we'll reinvest the money back into it at a certain rate, and we'll grow your business to many millions more a year than you have now already. All we ask for is a percentage cut increase of the increase in sales that your company generates as a result of our efforts on gross sales, not just from what the ads produce, but the gross sales in your company, somewhere between 1 and 10%. We've done this with several companies now so far, which we can tell you, I can tell you in a private conversation which ones they are, all of which are generating at minimum multi-millions a year and more in sales, whereas the companies before that, they didn't have it, they didn't know how to do it. If you've got a great product or service that you know will sell, you just need the best advertising, that's exactly what we can offer you. Let me know at guaranteedppc.com if you're interested in that. With that said, I'll wrap it up with that. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Remember when I said conversion goal was important during this video? Well, this video here tells you how to do it.